In April 2012, a lone survivor of a horrific massacre walked into the police station claiming his entire family had been killed. When officers arrived, they found the dead bodies of Dion Steenkamp, 44, his wife, 43, and their 14-year-old daughter, who had also been brutally assaulted. This family had no known enemies and was deeply loved by their community, until investigators realized the danger hadn't come from outside at all, but from within. So how did a quiet, unassuming boy become the key figure in one of the most disturbing and bizarre cases in South Africa's history?
A telling read that puts a spotlight on one of the most gruesome stories to come out of South Africa. Die Griquastad murder unfolded like a Hollywood movie. In 2012, the northern Cape Town was shook by a like no other.
Before we talk about what happened on April 6, 2012, it's important to first get to know the family. Dion Steenkamp was the kind of father who woke up at 5 a.m. to check on the livestock before his kids got up for school. He was 44 years old, built like a bear, with hands rough from decades of farm work. People in Griquastad, a tiny town in South Africa's Northern Cape, said Dion looked intimidating when you first met him. But the moment he smiled, you knew he was a teddy bear. He coached the under-18 tent pegging team, an equestrian sport popular in the region. He was a church deacon, the guy neighbors called when they needed help fixing a fence or settling a dispute. He believed in hard work, humility, and raising his kids to do the same. Christelle, his wife of 20 years, was the quiet one. 43 years old, with a green thumb that turned their property into a garden people drove miles to see. She'd recently started a baking business, supplying homemade goods to church events. Friends said she had a gift for remembering birthdays, asking about your family, and actually listening to the answer. She and Dion had built a life together rooted in faith, community, and their 2 children. Martella was 14, a straight-A student, a daddy's girl who practically glowed when Dion walked into a room. She attended boarding school 200 miles away, but every Friday afternoon, Dion and Christelle made the 4-hour round trip to bring her home. They never missed a weekend. Marthella's teachers described her as meticulous, the kind of student who color-coded her notes and rewrote assignments until they were perfect. She loved horses, loved her family, dreamed of becoming a veterinarian. She should have had decades ahead of her: high school graduations, a first love, a career, a family of her own. She should have turned 15. Don was the older sibling, 15 years old, quieter than his sister. Teachers said he kept to himself, got decent grades, and didn't cause trouble. The family seemed close, normal, happy. But if that's really how things were, we wouldn't normally cover this story on this channel. Because on April 6, 2012, 4 members of the same family were brutally bludgeoned to death. Poor Marthella was assaulted during the attack, and one survivor would later tell the chilling story.
Dion and Christelle Steenkamp and their daughter Martella were killed on their farm near Griquastad on Good Friday last year. Joubert believes the killer caught them off guard, possibly after removing the murder weapon from a safe in the bedroom. He says Christelle was shot from behind, while it appeared Dion had lunged towards the attacker. 14-year-old Martella was shot and beaten before she died. Joubert says the accused claims he found the murder weapons outside the farm gates is highly suspect. The trial has been adjourned till next week, when the defense is expected to call its first witness.
When officers pulled up to the Steenkamp farmhouse just after 7 p.m., the lights were still on inside. The property was massive, acres of open land, barns, livestock pens, but it was dead silent. No dogs barking, no sounds of a struggle. The front door wasn't smashed in. It was unlocked. They stepped inside and found Dion first, lying near the living room. A few feet away, near the kitchen, were Christelle and Marthella. All 3 were dead. The TV was still on. Dinner plates sat on the counter, barely touched. Dion had been shot 3 times, shoulder, chest, and behind the ear. His body was positioned like he'd tried to charge forward, tried to stop whoever was shooting. Blunt force trauma to his head suggested he'd also been struck with the butt of a gun. Christelle had been shot from behind 3 times, Shoulder, neck, back. She never even saw it coming. But Marthella's injuries were different, worse. She'd been shot twice in the body, twice in the head, struck with the gun hard enough to leave a crater in her skull. But here's what broke even the most hardened officers at that scene. Blood was pooled outside, near a tree about 20 feet from the house. Marthella had been shot inside. Then she ran. Bleeding, terrified, she made it out the back door and hid under that tree while the killer hunted her down. When he found her, he shot her in the face, beat her with the gun, left her for dead. And somehow she wasn't. Marthella, 14 years old, with gunshot wounds to her head and body, crawled back into the house. Her bloody handprint was found on the telephone. She tried to call for help. When that didn't work, she grabbed her father's arm and tried to pull him toward her before collapsing beside her mother. That's when the killer came back with a rifle and shot all three of them one final time. Investigators would later learn something even darker, something they kept quiet for months. Marthella had been sexually assaulted 12 to 24 hours before her death. The injuries were severe, and there was evidence of old scarring, meaning this wasn't the first time. Officers stood in that blood-soaked kitchen and tried to process what they were seeing. Blood on the walls, blood on the counters, a pool of it outside by the tree. The scene was so violent, so personal, that even veteran detectives said they had tears in their eyes. And yet, nothing was missing. Cash sat on the counter. Over 32,000 rand, about $2,000 USD, just lying there. Laptops, phones, credit cards. The family's gun safe was wide open, still full of firearms and ammunition. Car keys dangled in the ignition. If this was a robbery, it was the worst robbery in history. And then there were the dogs. The Steenkamps had 4 dogs. All of them were alive and well, tails wagging when police arrived. In South African farm attacks, which happen with tragic regularity, dogs are almost always poisoned or killed first. These dogs hadn't even barked. No forced entry. No missing valuables. No dead dogs. No tire tracks. No sign of anyone fleeing. It didn't look like a farm attack at all. It looked like something else entirely. And back at the police station, Don Steenkamp, the sole survivor of his family, would recount the terrifying events of that night, revealing the full story in his own words. He'd been in the barn for about 45 minutes, he said, working on some equipment. Then he heard gunshots, loud, echoing across the property. He froze, stayed hidden, waited for silence. After about 10 minutes, he crept toward the house. Inside, he found his parents on the floor, already dead. And then he saw Marthella. She was still alive, barely. He picked her up, he said, and she whispered, "I love you," before dying in his arms. She grabbed at his shirt, tearing it as she fell. Panicked, he ran back to the barn to hide. Then, when he was sure the killer was gone, he got into his father's truck and drove toward the main gate. On the way out, he spotted 2 guns lying on the ground about 50 meters from the house. He stopped, picked them up, put them in the truck. He pulled over briefly to warn some of the farm workers that something terrible had happened. Then he drove the 4 miles to the police station and ran inside screaming for help. Officers let him wash his hands, gave him clean clothes, sat him down, told him he was safe now. And for a few hours, everyone believed him. But Colonel Dick DeWall, a seasoned investigator with 30 years of experience, wasn't ready to close the book just yet. DeWall took Don back to the farm the next day and had him walk through the timeline again. He even set a timer to see if the story held up. Don said he was in the barn for 45 minutes, heard the shots, waited 10 minutes, ran inside, found his sister alive, held her as she died, ran back to the barn, got in the truck, stopped to grab the guns, warned the workers, drove to the station. Okay, let's test that. Cell phone records showed that Christelle sent a text message to Marthella at 6:34 p.m., a casual note about an upcoming family trip. That meant the murders happened after 6:34 p.m. Don arrived at the police station at 6:50 p.m. Do the math. If an intruder broke in after 6:34, shot Christelle from behind, chased Marthella outside, hunted her down under the tree, watched her crawl back into the house, went to get a rifle, and fired final shots into all three victims, and Don did everything he claimed, finding the bodies, holding his dying sister, hiding in the barn, driving 4 miles, stopping to grab guns and warn workers, that leaves 16 minutes for all of it. 16 minutes. Duvall stood in that barn and realized something. It was impossible, physically impossible, but that wasn't all. Don said Marthella tore his shirt when she grabbed him as she died. So investigators looked at the shirt. The blood pattern wasn't a smear. It wasn't a transfer from holding someone. It was spatter, the kind you get when you're standing close to someone as they're shot. And as we all know, forensics don't lie. And then there was the gunpowder residue. Tests came back positive on 2 of Don's shirts he'd been wearing that night. Not on his hands, on his clothes. Duvall asked Don why he'd changed his shirt. Don said the blood repulsed him. He couldn't stand looking at it. So he went to his bedroom, took off the torn, bloody shirt, and put on a clean one. Let me repeat that. Don believed a killer was still on the property. He believed his entire family had just been murdered by an armed intruder, and instead of running, instead of hiding, instead of getting the hell out of there, he went to his bedroom and changed his clothes. Does that sound like someone in fear for his life? And here's the kicker. Don said he heard more gunshots as he was driving away, which would mean the killer was still inside the house, still shooting, while Don was getting into the truck. So how did they not run into each other? The house wasn't that big. If Don went inside, found the bodies, went to his room, changed his shirt, ran back outside, got in the truck, and drove off, and the killer was still there, still shooting, they would have crossed paths. It's unavoidable, unless, of course, there was no other killer. Duvall kept digging, and what he found in the days after the murders was chilling. Text messages between Don and a friend revealed something prosecutors would later call a confession hiding in plain sight. In the exchange, the friend asked who police were looking at as suspects. Don's response was blunt. Only him. When the friend asked about fingerprints found at the scene, Don said only his were there. And when pressed about whether there was any other evidence that could point to someone else, Don's answer stopped investigators cold. He said no, they weren't going to find anyone else. And then there was the assault. 2 forensic doctors examined Marthella's body and confirmed she had been violently assaulted somewhere between 12 and 24 hours before her death. So here's the timeline investigators were staring at. Marthella was assaulted sometime on Thursday, and then, less than 24 hours later, her entire family was dead. What were the odds that someone assaulted Marthella on Thursday, and then a completely unrelated intruder broke into the farmhouse Friday night and murdered everyone? The odds were 0. Whoever had raped Marthella also killed her, and killed her parents to cover it up. And Don was the only person on that farm. On August 21st, 2012, 4 months after the murders, Colonel DeWall walked into Don's boarding school with a pair of handcuffs. The 16-year-old was arrested in his headmaster's office while other students watched through the windows. As he was led through the hallways to the waiting police car, Don didn't cry. He didn't protest. He didn't ask why this was happening. He just stared straight ahead, his face completely blank, as if he were watching something happening to someone else. Duvall later recalled the drive back to the station. A news bulletin came over the radio announcing that a 16-year-old had been arrested for the murder of the Steenkamp family. Duvall glanced in the rearview mirror to see how Don would react to hearing his arrest broadcast across the country. And for just a moment, he said, a slight smirk flickered across the boy's face before it went blank again. It was the first real emotion Duvall had seen from him. Not grief, not fear, not even anger. Just a brief, unsettling hint of satisfaction before the mask came back down. Don Steenkamp was formally charged with 3 counts of murder, 1 count of rape, and 1 count of defeating the ends of justice. When asked to enter a plea, he denied everything, not guilty on all counts. The trial began in 2014. In South Africa, there are no juries. Verdicts are decided by judges alone. Don's fate rested with Judge-President Frans Gomo. The prosecution laid out their case methodically. Don had assaulted his sister, Marthella. When she threatened to tell their parents, he killed all three of them. They also pointed to motive number 2, inheritance. Don stood to inherit approximately 23 million rand, nearly $1.3 million USD, and he'd get Marthella's share too. The day after the murders, one of the first things Don asked a psychologist was how the inheritance would be divided. The defense tried to argue that an intruder was still possible. They questioned the forensic evidence. They even suggested, horrifically, that Marthella's injuries could have been self-inflicted. But when Don took the stand, his story crumbled. Judge Kagomo later described him as a poor witness. Under cross-examination, he was caught in lie after lie, and through it all, he showed no emotion. One journalist covering the trial said they kept watching for some flicker of humanity. They never saw it. At one point, the entire court traveled to the farm so Judge Kagomo could see the scene for himself. When he stood at the spot where Don claimed to have found the guns, the judge said dryly that this would make the killer the dumbest farm attacker in South Africa. Someone who murdered a family, ran for the exit, dropped the weapons, then ran back inside to finish the job. When shown the open safe full of valuables, the judge quipped that the stolen kitchen knife must have been diamond-encrusted.
You are sentenced as follows. Count 1, the rape of Miss M, 14 years old, 12 years imprisonment. Count 2, the murder of Mr. D, 44 years old, 20 years imprisonment. Count 3, the murder of Mrs. C, 43 years old, 20 years imprisonment. Count 4, the murder of Miss M, mentioned in count 1, 20 years imprisonment. Count 5, defeating the ends of justice, 4 years in prison.
A very good afternoon. You're watching PM News. Our top story this hour. Northern Cape Judge-President Frans Gomo has sentenced the Griquas killer to an effective 20 years behind bars. The accused, a 17-year-old boy, killed the family at their farm in Nauvhoek near Griquas in 2012. Dion Steenkamp, his wife Christelle, and their daughter Marthella were shot to death. The judge said that the Griquas farm murderer was not used by anybody else or influenced by anybody to commit the Steenkamp murders.
2 days later, Don Steenkamp turned 18. The court order protecting his identity was lifted. If not for Don's age at the time of the crimes, he would have imposed life without parole. But South Africa's Child Justice Act limited his options, capping the maximum sentence for juveniles regardless of the severity of their crimes. The judge sentenced Don to 20 years in prison, with eligibility for parole after serving just 10. Don showed no reaction as the sentence was read, and the case became a national sensation almost immediately. Journalist Jacques Steenkamp, who bore no relation to the family, followed the trial closely and wrote a best-selling book chronicling the investigation, the evidence, and the devastating impact on the community. The book was later adapted into a film in 2019, ensuring that the story reached audiences far beyond South Africa's borders. The small town of Griquas, once known only for its farming community and quiet rural life, became synonymous with one of the country's most shocking family murders. And then, in 2024, something happened that reignited all the pain the Steenkamp family had been trying to bury for more than a decade. After serving 12 years of his 20-year sentence, Don Steenkamp applied for parole for the second time. His first application had been denied, with the parole board citing concerns about his continued refusal to take responsibility for the crimes. But this time, the board ruled differently. Despite objections from the extended Steenkamp family and victims' rights advocates, the parole board approved his release. Don Steenkamp walked free. The decision sparked immediate and widespread outrage. Victims' rights groups called it an insult to the memory of Dion, Christelle, and Marthella. Members of the Steenkamp family said publicly that it felt like losing them all over again, as though the justice system had decided 12 years was enough punishment for someone who brutally murdered 3 people, including a 14-year-old girl he had repeatedly assaulted. Over the years, this hasn't been the first time something like this has happened in a quiet rural town. One chilling case we've already covered is the Hinterkaifeck murder. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you in the next video.